like liberals, like the federal liberals and NDP who have been so vocally against this all week, even they, stumble over themselves to say that, Canadian parents love their children, so, okay, well, if you believe that, then there should be no concern with making sure that parents are notified when these things come up in school.
I guess you said one of the three stages. The first stage being this isn't happening and it's bad.
Yeah.
Second stage is like it sometimes happens and it's still bad, but it's rare, so it's okay.
But it's rare. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the third is, well, it's happening and it's good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And,
it isn't
and I
happening,
see,
but it is happening, and if it does happen, it's a good thing that it happened.
welcome to the Critical Compass podcast. Today we have a weekly catch-up from the events that have happened for the first week of February. I'm James, and this is Mike. And I guess we've had a lot going on in the last few weeks. And
It's been a big one.
Yeah, definitely a lot of excitement.
Yeah, well, all the hubbub this week has been centered around Danielle Smith's announcement. I think was it on Thursday last week or Friday last week that the Alberta government was going to be putting provisions in place to prevent various childhood gender medications and transition surgery and things like that. It was going to be severely limited, and actually, in my opinion, not limited enough. But we can get into that. But at least this was if you actually watch the video, I think she did a pretty good job of really, whether or not she was, and I believe she was, she certainly sounded sincere and compassionate about what she was talking about. And I don't think if somebody approached that video from a position of good faith, I don't think that they can say she spoke at all with any hate in her heart or anything like that. I don't know. What do you think?
If you watch the video without preconceived notions of what any of the politics are around that, and then you look at the response to it, these things do not seem to align.
Yeah.
I don't detect the hate in there. She's very careful with how she was describing these issues. She focused very much on the idea of adult choices and these non-reversible changes, and the idea, like, can these kids consent to these lifelong changes? That was one pillar. The other pillar was parents needing to be notified of name changes, and it's that parental consent portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that stems to the idea where, on the opposing side, they will say that these kids are at risk from abusive parents, but we already have a framework in place to deal with abusive children. So it doesn't really, I guess that it's kind of demonizing parents, saying that parents don't know the best for their children. They cannot offer guidance. They cannot make these decisions. And maybe that's the crux of the matter.
Yeah, well, the position from people who are against the notion of parental rights, in as many words, to me, seems to be that if a child is coming out to a teacher or discussing things with their teacher that they're confused about their gender identity or their sexuality or things like that, it's because they can't have those conversations with their parents because they fear retribution in some way. Now, we can maybe link to either some screenshots, or it might be a video or something I saw on X actually just the other day, where there actually seems to be the reason why they might have that notion is because there actually does seem to be teaching materials in the curriculum at least from one teacher that I saw, that was actually promoting that very idea that, you know, you actually should be, as a child, you should be worried about what your parents' reaction to these things might be. So that might be why they have this notion. I don't think it's a safe notion to have, or nor an accurate presupposition to be that, oh well, you know, the only safe place where I can talk about these things is in school with a teacher who isn't my parents. Like that's a little bit silly to have as your default assumption, and I don't think it's like liberals, like the federal liberals and NDP who have been so vocally against this all week. Even they, you know, stumble over themselves to say that, oh, Canadian parents love their children, you know. So, okay, well, if you believe that, then there should be no concern with making sure that parents are notified when these things come up in school.
Yeah, these two thoughts are incompatible simultaneously. Like both
Yeah.
parents love their children, but children are at risk from their parents, and they must have these conversations in private to like with parent or with teachers to hide these conversations from parents.
Yeah, with non-family members outside of the home. Yeah, it's silly, and it kind of parlays into another thing that I've seen a lot of, and anyone who follows us on X has no doubt seen our posts pointing this out to everyone who says it. The other most common thing that I've been seeing people talking about and posting regarding this is that, well, this isn't happening. Parents, teachers aren't having secret conversations with kids about their gender and sexuality. Okay, so the response is the same to that. If it isn't happening, then what's the problem? What's the problem if there's legislation in place just in case there's one teacher that decides to do it? The implication of the people saying that being, well, that it would be a bad thing if teachers are having secret sex conversations with kids, but it isn't happening. Okay,
Well,
so then let's ban it just in case.
Yeah, like the putting in a framework to prevent potential abuse within schools, or a teacher preying upon this friendship relationship with children, putting in a framework to protect children in this circumstance, especially they are vulnerable. If you look at the mental health comorbidities, these other conditions that go hand in hand, these are vulnerable children in other ways as well. So it doesn't take much to look at this situation, and well, even looking at some of these self-described teacher activists who outwardly admit and boast the number of students that have had these kind of conversations. We don't know to what degree parents were involved in this. I wouldn't assume that these activist teachers would involve the parents. They feel like it's their role to save these children or to help liberate these children from the like oppressive norms that their parents are enforcing on them. I guess you said one of the three stages. The first stage being this isn't happening and it's bad.
Yeah.
Second stage is like it sometimes happens and it's still bad, but it's rare, so it's okay.
It's rare. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the third is, well, it's happening and it's good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and
it isn't
and
happening, but it is happening, and if it does happen, it's a good thing that it happened.
Yeah. So on these discussions, you can see it bounce between these three, sometimes from the same person, as they like walk back within an argument, or they feel like they can't defend a position, so they take a step back.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating psychological. I don't know if it's a defense mechanism or what the actual psychology is behind it, but I'd love to know because I see it all the time. Yeah, it's the immediate, and you can see it anytime you watch. Like, there's tons of people on YouTube that do these kind of
the epistemology.
Like street interviews and stuff where they'll start with, they're very confident in the claim that something isn't X, and then when they just honestly, it just takes the littlest piece of evidence thrown at them that they completely switch and then start defending the point that they said isn't happening in the first place. So I don't know. I don't know, in order to be so vehemently in favor of something that you can both defend it not happening and also happening, like that's, I don't know, man. That's it. What is the quote of can't remember who said it, but it's like good people will do good things and bad people will do bad things, but in order to get good people to do bad things, that requires religion. Well, this feels like that.
Religion or any other ideology that
Yeah.
prevents
Any kind
people
of
from
cult
asking
ideology.
questions.
Yeah.
There's another way of can't remember who coins these phrases, but the idea of firm beliefs held loosely, that like you believe something and you can take quite a dramatic position on something, but it's held loosely in the way of like, well, if new evidence comes along, you should be able to, you're not emotionally tied to these ideas.
Yeah.
So
that's the scientific method, really. That's what it should be at the end of the day.
Yeah, and the tricky thing with this discussion around like the transgender youth is the data is a little muddy. You run into issues with it's the data is not really supporting the idea of like transitioning at a young age or puberty blockers. There's one study that looked at the desistance rate when there was no intervention, that they found that if children had gender dysphoria and then went through puberty, about 80% of them turned out to be gay, and it desisted after that.
Yeah.
The other issue with the data is you have issues with study design and bias in how they do follow-ups.
Yeah.
So there is an issue that when people detransition, they are not happy and they often lose contact or stop talking with some of the doctors who originally prescribed them puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or did the surgery.
Yeah.
So the amount of follow-up, that's a whole giant question mark right now. Of we don't actually know a lot of that information gets kind of thrown out and isn't reflected on studies. And then you have what's the duration of studies? What is the follow-up period? Did they check 6 months after starting somebody on testosterone? Well, of course they're going to feel happy with this influx of their body's barely adapted to this, and they're getting this rush and this feel-good drug. They're getting love bombed, and you get this short-term euphoria that is not maintained long-term. But if the study only looks at these short-term outcomes, then you can't really make decisions on the long-term off of these studies, and these studies get passed around or quoted a little bit more than they should.
Yeah. Well, and the study that you were just mentioning about the 80% just ending up being gay once they go through puberty, that just knowing that should be enough to halt any of this mad rush to affirm and to start kids on blockers and cross-sex hormones. I mean, it's if anything else in your life had an 80% chance of being wrong, you wouldn't do it. Not like, and especially anything medically related, right? There's just you don't take odds against that, you know. Another statistic that I read last year when I read Time to Think by Hannah Barnes, a fantastic book. She talks about the Tavistock JIDS clinic, a gender identity services clinic, I believe, and how it's since been shut down. It was active for a few decades and had to be shut down due to many reasons, but primarily because there was no evidence of long-term effectiveness of any of their policies and procedures, but also because they were getting bombarded with lawsuits from detransitioners who felt that they were rushed to certain conclusions when they were kids before they could properly consent to these things. And now that they're young adults and they realize that what they've done to themselves is not actually what they wanted the rest of their lives to be, well, it's too late for some of them that are now sterilized. They'll never be able to experience an orgasm. They'll never be able to have any normal reproductive or sexual function anymore. It's pretty ghastly stuff.
Yeah, the side effects are not minor by any means.
No, and sorry, the other statistic I was going to say from that book, I believe it's 60 or 65% of the children who were in the care of the Tavistock Clinic also presented clinically as on the autism spectrum. So what you've got is statistically a gay autistic kid who, of course, doesn't understand. If they're in their tweens or early teens or whatever, of course they're going to be like any other normal teen. They're going to be uncomfortable with their body. Things are going to be changing. Hormones are going to be surging, and as happens in adolescence. But add in the fact that they're unsure of their sexuality. They know that most people are straight, and they are not straight. Maybe they come from a family. This is a legitimate concern. Maybe they come from a family that has very traditional values of, that might be against homosexuality. That would be very common. And if they're autistic as well, then they can't properly, rationalize all these changes. And if somebody presents them with a quote unquote solution that, well, maybe you're just the wrong gender, well, then maybe they're more likely to go along that path if they feel like this is going to be a quick and complete cessation of these feelings that they're having, that they don't understand how to process.
Well, you look at these additional mental health conditions, often depression, anxiety, and the autism side of it. All those are somewhat tied into your perception of yourself. And I think you run into a case where these things would normally, throughout puberty and throughout adolescence, you would find ways of growing through these, and sometimes you don't grow them, and sometimes these are lifelong conditions that maybe somebody isn't getting treated or just hasn't found a solution. But anytime you have overlap in symptoms, you have to look at root cause. And if somebody's wanting to get a surgery because they think they don't feel good the way they are now, is that because there's something that needs to be cut off? Like, is that a surgery problem, or is that a counseling? Is that a mindset? Is that a
lifestyle?
Are we actually looking at the root cause at this point?
Well, that's one of the that's a perfect point to bring up, because it shows just how differently we treat whatever our modern conception of gender dysphoria is, how differently we treat it from every other dysphoria that we already have a psychological literature on. You don't treat anorexia by affirming that, oh yes, you look so much better when you're skinny, you should limit your food, or bulimia, but this is totally working, you should keep throwing up all the food that you eat. Or there's a condition called body dysmorphic integrity disorder, I think it's called.
Is that the limb one?
Yeah, where people feel for whatever reason that they feel that they should be they should have they should be an amputee of some part or multiple parts of their body. You don't affirm that by performing those surgeries. That would be ridiculous to even suggest.
Well, who are you to question how they truly feel about themselves? If they feel like that leg is not supposed to be there, they were assigned two-legged when they were
assigned bipedalism at birth.
Yeah.
It would be just like you would be laughed out of a anywhere if you had that notion.
Here's the issue, though. There are two trains of thought that coexist, and they're used depending on how convenient it is in an argument. And one of them is that the gender dysphoria is real and must be treated with puberty blockers, affirmation therapy, and or surgery if somebody chooses. The other train of thought is that this depends on how you define it, and these definitions are not, it's hard to ever actually narrow down a definition of what it means to identify as the other gender. And those who basically say that you can identify as anything and your identity is real and you exist as that, they also say that, well, being transgender is not, it's not a dysphoria. It's not a mental condition. So both, you have a train of thought of, yeah, dysphoria is real, but you also say dysphoria is not required for somebody to go in for surgery, because you have people saying that, well, these people go in for extensive psychological evaluation. But at the same time, it got, I believe it got delisted. I don't know what the actual term for, I think the DSM-5 or 6 or whatever number they're on, they have removed transgenderism as a mental condition.
Oh, okay.
So this is why you can see in conversations, people get a little bit upset or triggered, even mentioning the mental health side of it, even though it is strongly correlated with all these other mental health conditions that go alongside. The fact that they're saying that it's not, it means, well, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, because they'll probably say that it's a it can't be a mental condition or a, you know, anything viewed as potentially like a weakness or or any sort of negative connotation, because what they'll say, I'm sure, is that they've always been transgender. They were always in the wrong body. And you might even hear people love to do this who are proponents of gender ideology. They love to talk out of both sides of their mouth and say things like, we always knew little Timmy was actually a girl, because when Timmy was young, she always liked to play with, girls' toys. Timmy always liked to play with dolls and makeup and stuff. So when Timmy was 12, we transitioned him to a her. That's because we always knew. But then at the same time, they'll say, if a little girl, a biological girl, plays with the dolls and the makeup and the other traditionally, stereotypically girls' things, that was because society conditioned her to like those things.
Is that the patriarchy in action causing the girls to play with dolls?
The childhood patriarchy in action, yeah. So it, I don't know. To me, that seems like a contradiction. It feels like it has to be one or the other. But the point is, if you view it that way, then what you're actually doing is you're viewing somebody's gender as equivalent to maybe something like the soul or some other sort of metaphysical, spiritual conception of what it means to be a person. So in that case, how can it be a dysphoria, or how can it be anything related to a treatable mental condition? If it's a treatable mental condition, then that means it can't be your identity, I suppose.
Yeah, and any idea of a gendered soul is unfalsifiable, and you can't prove or disprove. It's based on how somebody feels. Yeah. So you touched on a couple key points of the difference between when you define this. Is it a way that you feel? Is it a way that you act? Is it what does it mean to identify me as a biological man? If I identify as a woman, well, what does that actually mean? Am I doing the things that women do? Am I presenting as a woman? So these secondary sex characteristics. When I say I feel like a woman, well, what is that feeling? Are we talking about the big 5 personality traits? Am I low on assertiveness? And do I'm look inward and say that my personality more resembles these traditionally feminine. If we observe the population, we can observe like masculine and feminine, in quotes, like traits. They're just more commonly represented in males versus females. So
Yeah.
our whole notion of what it means to look or feel or even behave as a woman is still tied to these biological averages throughout the population. And I've yet to get a really good definition. You'll ask activists or just somebody who has bought into this, and you start going through this, and at some point they're just going to say, well, they are a woman because they feel like a woman.
Yeah, a woman
That's their
is
identity.
whoever identifies as a woman, right? Yeah. They can't make the definition not contain the word woman, basically. So it becomes self-referential and begs the question, basically.
Yeah, circular definitions don't really give you anything to, you don't gain anything more from that definition. You still are no closer to understanding what a woman is if the definition of a woman is the identity of a woman.
Yeah.
Like what characteristics are under there, and then
what characteristics and what of those characteristics are not just a stereotype?
Yeah. So are we going backwards if we're just tying these ideas of these identity, like an identity of woman, to stereotypes? Are we further limiting our ideas of what women should do or the way women are based on reinforcing these older stereotypes?
Well, I have a theory, and I don't know. I don't think I've stolen this from anyone. I think, but other people may have reached the same conclusion. I believe actually that, and maybe this is extreme of me, but I actually don't think that the word gender has any useful meaning. I feel like when people say gender, if they're not using it as a synonym for sex, male or female, and they separate those, then what I believe they mean, what they actually mean when they say gender, either it boils down to one of two things: either a sexuality, like a sexual proclivity or preference, or two, a personality trait. And I've challenged people to this on X before, and same as you, I don't really get a clean answer to it or a concise answer to it, but I would challenge anyone, maybe anyone listening who disagrees with me on this, if you can describe your gender that isn't that doesn't boil down to just either a personality trait or a sexual proclivity, I would be very interested to know, because that's all that I hear about it. When somebody says they're, usually what they're referring to, like say that they're, maybe agender, well, probably that means if you're a woman, maybe you're a little bit bisexual and maybe you present a little bit more androgynous. It may be the same for a man too. Agender is just one that came to mind, but there's no doubt countless examples. But that's my theory. I'm sticking to it until proven otherwise.
Well, if there's a word that's commonly used in our society and it interacts with the way people live their lives, we would want a clear definition of that word. We want to make sure that we all know what it means and we're all using it in the same ways. And if gender is sometimes used for sex and then sometimes used for just describing how people feel based on traits or personality, then it doesn't really describe the usefulness of that word. It's useless except for people's feelings about themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if somebody says, well, I identify as female, great. They just told us that they maybe act or feel a little bit more feminine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean? How do we navigate? Do we treat them differently now just because they have a few more feminine traits? Or are we at this point where differences in some of these big five personality traits don't really matter as much on a day-to-day basis? You'll naturally find people who maybe in like a heterosexual relationship, the high assertiveness in males is still like still a desirable trait from women when they're dating men in a relationship. They still look for these things. So in those cases, these personality traits, maybe if they fit these traditional kind of averages across the, like when we sample our population, like maybe it's more stable in those circumstances. But on the fringes, you'll always have tomboys, and you always have like
feminine men, and
and there's, we even look at like the artist community, like there's all kinds of misfits, like, well, and that's where you get,
we're both members of that misfit artist community, so we know it's absolutely true. But and the point of it is too that like I hate that, you know, we have to do this, because if anyone knows us in real life, they know that we're not judgmental people. We're not, we don't go out seeking to, be rude to people or disrespectful or mean or anything like that. So I hate that I have to say it, but what this ultimately comes down to is I know you would agree, don't believe that there's any right or wrong way to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. There's just the way that you are. And that's fine. And you should be able to have a community that you can, have friends and relationships in and be accepted for exactly who you are. I think that actually that's much less sexist and divisive and exclusionary. I think that's a word. Than being the other way, where, if you have to take it back to the schools, if you have an activist teacher who looks at a little boy who maybe is more interested in playing with the stereotypically girls' toys, or a little girl who's more interested in playing, sports or something more stereotypically boyish or masculine, to suggest that those little boys or girls are exhibiting signs of transgenderism or are truly the opposite sex or whatever, that seems to me to be very regressive and sexist and not accepting of the differences in personality that everyone has.
It's amplifying these differences in a way. It was saying these differences means you are now in this other category. And the fact that the transgender category now includes non-binary. So if you feel like, well, these wearing a dress or these traditional ideas of what it means to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, if you don't really agree with that, you're considered non-binary. I've had people accuse, when I say I don't think gender exists, like gender as a concept doesn't exist, and we're just men and women with variations in personality.
Yeah.
And being told you're non-binary, welcome to the club.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. That's good.
So
yeah, I like when I hear that somebody's a non-binary transgender person. What did you trans to from?
Yeah, they're still tied to these. You can't escape some of these binaries.
It's a definitional problem.
Yeah, I did have one thought that actually came up, and I didn't actually really think about this until this conversation today, but we talked about affirmation and started thinking about you have some teachers, the teachers that fall into that community who are themselves, they are partially an activist because their identity is within the LGBTQ community. But I started thinking of this idea as affirmation, and I have a feeling some of these teachers are using their students as a way to affirm their own identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's less, maybe it's a little bit like through affirming, being there to help a child affirm themselves. They are reinforcing the feelings within themselves as a teacher, and their own identity is now
I think that's
affirmed. It's being recognized.
Yeah.
And I guess my evidence from this is the self-proclaimed activists who are almost bragging, 7 out of my 25 students have opened up to me, and these 8 or 9 year olds are opening up to you
And they're in fourth
about
grade?
their like identities at this point, their sexual identities, their gender identities at that age. Well, that they seem very happy that like a good portion of their class, like 1/4 of their class, is comfortable enough to discuss these things. So that again opens up the idea of there's a G word that people don't like to hear. And
yeah.
I guess the idea of grooming is the connotations are, I can see why it's a charged word because it implies kind of the worst of the grooming.
Yeah.
But in a way,
Epstein-esque maybe.
Yeah, like go to like grooming in the sense of like criminal acts, but there's
grooming gangs, whatever. Yeah.
But there's
it
this
does
idea
have a softer definition though, like you're, I think, implying.
There's this idea of love bombing children. First of all, you assert that there's something wrong or that there's a problem, and the problem is they're born into the wrong body, or that there's a mismatch between how you look and how you feel. And through these layers of complexity of these ideas, because you have the whole gingerbread, genderbread person, whatever, these kind of analogies to teach the children, you start wrapping up these ideas in more complexities. You've kind of created a barrier, and now you have the knowledge holders. You have these teachers as a source of knowledge, wisdom, and also they are a source for love of these kids. So they start love bombing these children and also telling them, well, you're not safe around your parents because your parents don't have access to this knowledge. They don't agree with this knowledge, or there's already this divide happening. That in a way is grooming children to be comfortable with adults outside of parents and families and friends
in a very intimate way that doesn't seem appropriate for the relationship that a student teacher should have, really.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that not only are they using it as an affirmation for themselves, potentially, for these specific activist teachers that we're talking about at their current stage of life, I feel like also there is a thought, just to completely put myself in their head and just completely mind read right now. I know this is a fallacy, but I believe that probably they think that if only they had a teacher like that when they were a young kid who legitimately was confused about their sexuality or their identity, that they would have grown up they would have had a better childhood and a better adolescence and adulthood than they had. And I think there may even actually be some merit to that, depending on the age of the teacher and the specific circumstance, because of course, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was a much different social landscape than it is now, and there was much more prejudice and non-acceptance.
There's explicit hate.
That's right, and it was still illegal in many parts of North America, even 30 years ago. So I can understand a little bit the natural inclination to want to be somebody's reason that they feel comfortable with themselves, but it's misplaced, and it's not modernized. They're approaching these topics of, like, 20, 30 years ago, there was not this rush to medically affirm, go on medication, go on cross-sex hormone. Like, this was not something that happened with the degree in the percentages that we see now. So it is different, and it's dangerous because, well, the saying goes that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? This is a much more complex issue than, just a teacher simply saying, well, I'm just accepting my students for who they are, and I'm making them feel free to, to express themselves. It's different than that. And I think we need to recognize that it's different without implying that we agree that parents should be, abusive towards their kids who are showing these things. Of course, that's not true. Of course, that shouldn't happen. But there needs to be a little bit more of a recognition of there are certain things that are sacred within a family, and there are certain things that are not meant to be. There's certain things that are meant to be kept to trusted loved ones only, and there's a level of professionalism that's being crossed in a relationship that would not have happened, even maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, it is possible to hold the position of thinking that teachers have a certain role to play and that parents should love their children unconditionally. And obviously we should be advocating and reminding parents, like, there's abrasive ways of navigating this issue with your children, and there's less abrasive ways. There's obviously, you can navigate any situation with compassion, but this idea of that affirmation and unbounded love and compassion without any ties to reality is, I think that's where harm happens. Like, this idea of tough love is that when you love somebody, you will tell them truths that are uncomfortable. It's the same thing. If you have a friend who is not going to tell you you've got a little bit of mustard, like on the side of your mouth, and you're just sitting there, like, you don't want to hear that because it's embarrassing. And like, nobody wants to be told that. Nobody wants to be told that. It's like, maybe your idea of how things are going does not line up with the reality of that you're facing in front right now. So I think tough love is still a compassionate. It's still a compassionate way to navigate, because you're getting somebody closer to the realities of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it also, shows how you can't get a full picture of some, like, I know that these teachers might think that they know their students intimately, and they know them, some maybe say they know them better than they know themselves, at a certain age or whatever. But it's a very small portion of their life that they're going to be interacting with this one person, and they're going to be with their family their whole lives, or as long as their families stay together. So it's a extreme act of hubris to believe that you who see this kid 40 hours a week, 35 hours a week maybe, are better able to guide them through potentially life-changing medical alterations to their biology than their own family would know. It's a little bit much. And I've had this discussion. I have a family member who's a teacher who has told me before about the students that a young student in this person's school, who the school has decided to affirm and treat as, it's a little boy who is living who has changed their name and their pronouns to that of a girl. The kid is in grade 4, I think, maybe grade 5. And they thought it was fine because, the student has ostensibly always known, the family has always known, that the little boy was actually a little girl, and likes to dress in dresses and act, have long hair, and so they're affirming. So, and they didn't see any issue with this, and so we talked about it a little bit, and me being an insufferable podcast host who talks about these things, co-host, started asking some questions, and really the one that triggered them to kind of think about this a little differently is when I asked, so what are you going to do? What is going to happen with this kid who's maybe 8 or 9 years old, something like 9 or 10 maybe now. Call it a 10-year-old kid. What are you going to do in 2 or 3 or 4 years when they start getting facial hair and their voice starts dropping, their shoulders start widening, their Adam's apple starts forming? What are you going to do? This kid has been affirmed for however many years leading up to this point. So is that when the puberty blockers start? Okay. A couple years after that, they're still living this way. Is that when the cross-sex hormones start? Are they being put on by simply having the act now when they're a little kid who, and like all little kids up to a certain age are androgynous to an extent. Like little boys and girls are interchangeable for the most part. Other than how they act, and usually the little boys are psychotic and usually the little girls are little princesses. But when you know, things start getting real and puberty starts to kick in and these unavoidable biological changes start to happen, what are you going to do? And that starts to become a little bit more of a serious and a little bit more of an uncomfortable discussion to have.
Well, here's the thing. In that case, you've affirmed an identity, and then it seems like it's very much tied to traditional norms of like long hair, dress, and
100%.
a lot
There's
of these secondary like sexual characteristics.
Oh, they never like to play sports. They only like to play with his sister's dolls. So
if there's a mismatch between how somebody feels about themselves inside and what their outside is, like obviously somebody's born biologically male and dresses like a girl, you're still fighting the body wanting to, it's down a path of development to produce like small mobile gametes, sperm, and the body through the hormone profile that it has will structure around that.
Yeah.
And then even at that age, bones are still, like you look at the frames of boys and girls, they're still not identical per se.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that you can just like start it at a certain point, you're chasing this, you're fighting biology at this point.
At every point. Yeah, and certainly more so when puberty starts to kick in. Yeah, and then you have to make, they're going to have to make a real decision because, you know, yeah, so I don't know. It was a little bit, it bummed me out a little bit, and I hope that maybe, you know, I don't know. I can't know, but if anything was said or changed about how they treat this kid, but I just worry that they're going to grow up and they're going to realize that, oh, maybe I was just always a bit of an effeminate boy, but I was affirmed by my teachers and my family and everyone surrounding me. And so I just thought I was a girl. And now I wonder why I'm a young adult and nothing feels right and I'm not happy. Maybe it would have just been better if somebody didn't even put these ideas in my head as a kid in the first place.
So what's going to happen is either the kid does not go through puberty and starts becoming more masculine in their body, and that further does not sit right and makes them feel even worse about the fact that inside they feel like a girl and on the outside they're looking more like a man.
Or what they've been told, more accurately, what they've been told feeling like a girl is like. Oh, you show these traits of the things that you are interested in, your personality traits, because they're too young to have a sexuality develop yet. What their personality traits were indicating was that of femininity.
Yeah. Or the second path is puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and some sort of a surgery to affirm as well. But at this point, people may have an idea of what the ideal feminine female form is. And I think it doesn't take that much to pull up examples of people transitioning and chasing through surgeries the fact that, like, well, what's their jawline like? What's their shoulders? And they keep on having to make these modifications because there's so many innate differences between men and women. For the most part, we are more the same than we are different. And then you look at these differences, we have how many, like, millions of years of evolution of us being able to recognize these small little differences in face and bone structures. And that's why people can predict somebody's sex with accuracy most of the time. Like, it's a pretty accurate, like,
instantly.
Somebody doesn't need to be specially trained. It's something, even when people have their faces are covered or they have different clothing on, like, the average person is still pretty good at detecting this, which means you are fighting some of these very, very subtle differences that either they're going to be a lifelong patient at that point. If they don't get the root cause of why are you not feeling comfortable in the body you were born in. So
yeah,
that's a tricky situation for sure.
Yeah, so it's yeah, it is, and it's
well, good. We have some framework, like some frameworks in Alberta to help. Maybe if this lets a couple kids maybe give more time to think, and maybe some adults choose to have some surgeries, and maybe some just realize that they're gay and they can live their lives and they can dress and act the way that they want. Like, if that saves a few children or a few young adults from getting a surgery and having lifelong complications, like that's worth it in my mind.
Yeah, that's a win, I think, for sure. Yeah, and I think it's there are many thinkers in this space who have predicted that within the next 5 to 10 years, people are going to be doing everything they can to distance themselves from ever having a strong opinion in favor of childhood puberty blockers, surgeries, transition, cross-sex hormones.
Because when the lawsuits start,
when the lawsuits happen, and when public opinion shifts, as it does in every era, in every social, sociological, I don't want to say craze, but you know what I mean, of the time. Every era has their own thing, and without fail, it ends up being sent to the dustbin of history. So yeah, it's a kind of a crazy time to be a kid. I had a friend of mine on my Instagram. I post some stories sometimes of clips from Twitter posts and stuff about this topic, and I had a friend today actually just message me and say that she is so glad that she grew up in the 90s and not now, because she was the definition of a tomboy as a kid. Never liked having long hair. Always put her hair up or made her parents cut it short. And liked playing sports and was just, not feminine at all. And now as an adult, she's in her 30s now. She's 100% a girly girl. She hates, any little bit of like peach fuzz on her face, she says, and she always, she does her makeup and has her hair long now, and hates any form, like she says she describes herself as naturally a little bit androgynous, and she doesn't like that about herself anymore. She wants to actually be more feminine. So that goes to show, right? There's
things
very
change.
little. Oh, things change. Well, and there's very little about yourself as a kid or an adolescent that won't be different in some way in a few years. And I think you just have to wait and see.
Yeah. So it seems like some of the conversations are shifting. There's some good. There's at least more awareness, and it feels like sometimes it takes some of these key voices for maybe some of the other politicians or key commenters to finally get some courage to actually take a stand. I know.
Yeah.
Polyev finally kind of he denounced childhood transition.
Puberty blockers, yeah, for sure. He's been quoted before as saying he is totally in favor of parents' rights and wants governments to stay out of parental decisions. But today, yes, he was he was very clear on
a little bit more direct, because the other I can see how historically with the media, this situation that we have with the media, that they'll take any little statement and just beat it to death and mass repeat it and make something. If they can make it into something, they will, and they'll use it against you. And I don't want to defend any, like, there's obviously certain politicians that have a bigger backbone and have been very consistent and very vocal about their messages for a long time. Then there's others who wait a little bit longer before it's safer to say these things. And I wish there was less waiting, And
Mm-hmm,
I also
mm-hmm.
wish some of these positions were very clear and that there was less of a risk to having any opinion outside of a very narrow band of opinions.
Well, it's been, yeah, like you say, it is historically with many issues. I mean, I can think back to COVID issues just from a couple of years ago. It will always take one or two politicians or public figures in some way to risk being the first one to be called a conspiracy theorist or a radical or a far right or whatever, to bear that weight and be the first one. And then once those ideas start to be forced into the kind of force open the Overton window a little bit, then you start to see more and more people actually were thinking of this all along, and now that it's safer to do it. I think Polyev has done this a couple times with certain issues, but he, in his defense, I believe he's struck a pretty decent balance of being generally right about most things when he does make a statement on them, and not waiting too long so that you get the impression that he's just waiting for opinion polls to roll in. I believe that at least the way that he's treated the his MPs as conservative leader thus far is, in my opinion, is that he has tried to avoid unnecessarily fanning flames or jumping into a debate when it's very, very fresh and raw, and waiting 2, 3, 4 days to kind of have a reasoned, more a lower temperature take on it, because it's not fresh and wild in people's minds. So,
Which is a good
we'll
reminder
see.
for any of us to, as something comes out, like sometimes event A will happen and everybody's up in arms, and I'm always curious to like wait for a little bit more, or wait for the next little bit of evidence or the next key piece of anything. So that is a good reminder to like, things happen so fast on the internet, but we can take a day or two just to like, before we have our full emotional reaction to something, we can like take a step back. I did want to say, with the Overton window expanding, another thing happened in the last couple of weeks is Tucker Carlson came to Alberta, and with some massive shows, and well, he had one at, was it Rogers Place? Like he filled out a stadium.
Was it at the Saddle Dome in Calgary too? Like
I
I
believe
don't know
so.
if it
Yeah.
was. Yeah. So the
The
biggest,
like
basically the biggest arenas.
huge attendance. And he did cover some good things, but the week before that, he had somebody on his show and he did an interview, and they were talking about the Coutts Four. And that was also mentioned. And Danielle Smith mentioned the Coutts Four protesters that were still locked up after 2 years. And
And
I
lo
don't
and
know,
behold,
it feels like that and the decision on the Emergency Act, like the saying that it was unconstitutional, those two things happened in the last 2 weeks. What happened just now is that 2 of the members of Coutts are now, they're now let out, and this is something
they took plea deals, right?
Yeah.
And notably, there, and you'll be able to expand more on this because you follow this closer than I did. But the two of the 4 who have been released have had their charge of conspiracy to commit murder against an RCMP officer dropped.
Yes. And that was the whole reason they were denied bail.
Yeah, for 2.5 years, or almost 2.5 years.
Yeah, more than 2 years. Like
oh yeah, no, sorry, it's not 2.5 years. It's about 2 years.
700 days or something.
Yeah, okay.
When you're into the hundreds of days, that's still a significant amount of time. And apparently, like roughly 60 days of solitary confinement as well, because there's issues. One thing to note is, in Canada, if you're not convicted of something, you don't go to a normal prison, you go to a remand center, and you don't have full rights of a prisoner yet because you're not fully convicted. And so there's numerous accounts of somebody awaiting a sentencing, going through the ringer and being put through abuse. And one example is that many days of solitary confinement partially happened because there was, I think, the members of the Coutts Four, since they were all being tried, they could not be in the same location. So I think they had to separate them. And they used solitary confinement as a way of separating some of them in prison because they could not have contact because they're worried about, well, are they going to corroborate their cases or change their discussions? And so I guess just a recap of the situation, trucker convoy happened in Ottawa, but you had the Coutts border, or like the town of Coutts, Alberta, southern Alberta, bordering on
Montana,
yeah. You had that blockade happening, and right before the Emergency Act was implemented, and when tensions were high, all of a sudden, RCMP found a weapons cache of all these assault weapons, and they charged the Coutts Four, with conspiracy to commit murder, or conspiracy to murder police officers, which would be RCMP in this case. And that happened, and it was referenced as the reasons, as justification of why the Emergency Act was necessary because of this threat.
Right.
So that ties in.
All these weapons were like found in, if I have the story right, they were found in like one truck too, right?
I think they were found in like a shed miles away.
Oh, okay,
they weren't even, it's not like they were even right there at the border. So they were charged. The other thing on it is one of the vests in the pictures had a little patch, a black patch with a slash,
Diagalon.
A
I
Diagalon.
hope to God Rachel Gilmore isn't listening to this podcast right now. She could not.
Yes.
She could not even.
It's, well, there you have the whole anti-hate. That's another side of it, is that they tied it to Diagolon, which was listed as a alt-right extremist acceleration group, which is run by Jeremy McKenzie. He's a podcaster and comedian. And you can see he has episodes on how they created Diagalon, which is a make-believe country. They decided country. It's a meme. They looked during the lockdowns. They looked at, well, which provinces and which states had the least restrictions and were the most free. And they looked at Alaska and like Alberta and then Montana and then like Texas and Florida, and they made it. They made it like the line doesn't go straight down; it goes in a diagonal.
Yeah.
So they drew that. He said he made the design for the logo by like an app on his iPhone, and he like dragged his finger down to like draw a line on that, and that's the whole flag. And the vice president of this fake country is a cocaine addicted goat named Philip. So given this meme, the fact that this got mentioned in the House of Commons and the Senate as a existential threat either means our intelligence service, they're completely corrupt or incompetent.
Or both.
A little bit of both, yes.
Yeah. Little column A, little column B.
There have been some documents showing that the there's kind of a revolving door between antihate.ca, that they will kind of do a dossier and then the government references, or news organizations reference anti-hate, which is funded by the government, they look at alt-right extremists, or they'll label people as alt-right. And this is their whole thing. They're combating hate by singling out people that are fascists. It's kind of, there's an overlap kind of with Antifa, but they're more a formal organization. And it's worth us exploring that because there's some good exposés on what documents and the corruption of this government-funded group, which is then referenced by the government as proof that these things exist. It is idea laundering, and it is giving justification for these actions. So the Antihate was part of it, and then the government references the link to Diagalon because of these patches in this photo. The thing is, the Coutts Four, they were charged but not convicted with the conspiracy to murder police officers, and denied bail for 2 years. And one thing did happen. The defense did ask for a publication ban. It wasn't the prosecution. It was the defense, because they wanted to prevent the media from just slandering every little thing. But that that doesn't stop the media from talking about why these 4 individuals were in jail for 700 days or more, why the process was taking so long.
Yeah, well, we have in Canada. I mean, I don't know that it's the same wording or the same, privation of law, if that's the term, as the U.S. has. But look, we have the right to a speedy trial, right?
Speedy trial is not 2 years.
No, that's certainly
taking days to uncover one little envelope that doesn't actually get anything. If you dive into the trial, there's been so much waste of time.
Sorry.
It is, yeah.
I need to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I just looked up privation, and that's not the word I meant. It's provision of law. Pardon me. Carry on.
Good to clarify. So as it stands, this week, Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin, they pleaded guilty to firearm charges.
Yeah, it was like an unregistered handgun or something.
I think a improper storage of a handgun.
Okay.
And they pleaded not guilty to conspiracy to murder police officers.
That charge was withdrawn, wasn't it? Like it was just it was dropped completely. So I'd love to know
they take 2 years to
drop a charge like that.
That's the thing is, right now, what there needs to happen is there needs to be enough vocal public awareness on this, and there needs to be inquiry of what the hell's happened with this process, because there's definitely some misconduct.
For sure.
In this process. And if you look at the original kind of CBC article and the original description of this, and there's summarizing the initial part of the trial, apparently these 4 had a drink with an undercover female police officer, and a conversation was heard of them talking about smuggling weapons. It across or into the blockade. Now, if they had physical evidence and recordings, then yeah, they should have brought that up and that should have been dealt with right away. But maybe there was something like they were making a joke, or maybe the female police officers oh, so if somebody was to smuggle weapons in, how would you do it? Kind of a leading question, or it doesn't take much to imagine a scenario of, well, you're at a point where the Ottawa convoy has been there for weeks, and the government's looking at some way to get out of this. We have a history of RCMP scandals. We know that they do shady things from once in a while. They even sabotaged excavators and some heavy equipment in Coutts. They damaged people's equipment to make it immobile and unable to be used. And I think there's still a lawsuit going on there. So we know they've done shady things, and if they had material evidence, it would have been addressed and it would have been dealt with.
It would have been open and shut with a heavy charge like that, right?
Yeah, it shouldn't take 2 years to go through that. Conveniently, the inquiry to the Emergencies Act they happen before this trial has got to this point. What it feels like is that this 2 year delay is that you have this thing that was used as a justification for the Emergencies Act, and it's not resolved. Therefore, it can still be mentioned as a threat or an ongoing reason during that inquiry. If it was wrapped up before the inquiry, you'd have other material evidence that would, well,
not be in the government's favor.
If the charges were solid, you think they would have wrapped it up and it would have been used as evidence in the Emergency Act commissions into the inquiry. They would have used it then. So,
well, and then another thing that this is a little bit unrelated, but to speak to corruption in at the very least the media, but if not potentially some RCMP or police sources. They already tried before the Coutts Four. They already tried to do that in Ottawa during the protest. If you recall, there was the false story that was tweeted by, I think it was just a private individual, but it was amplified and written about by Rachel Gilmore for Global News. The false arson attempt on that residential apartment building in downtown Ottawa. There was a story that was published, and they, without any evidence, linked a very spurious story of a attempted arson on a residential apartment building to the Convoy, which was very, very quickly found to be complete nonsense, complete horseshit from the start.
But what is
a retraction was never written by Gilmore, by the way.
What is the length of memory for the average person, though?
Minutes.
So that's the issue, is even when retractions, well, think of it this way. You have loud headline and really, really quiet retraction.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's the net effect of loudly proclaiming something?
Yeah, well, it had the effect in the public anyway. Like there are still people who believe that the convoy in Ottawa was causing havoc in downtown Ottawa and accosting people, and there are still people who have this.
You mean
idea.
The hundreds of hours of live stream footage hasn't convinced them otherwise?
That's what I always tell people when it comes up, and they still believe this. Is like you can literally, from half a dozen sources that I could point you to in 10 minutes, you can literally watch the whole protest from start to finish, all 3 weeks of it. It was
multiple
all live
angles, all kinds of different people.
Angles. It was all live streamed, the whole thing. There was not a single part of it that wasn't on video, and I don't know. Anyway, we could go on all night about this. We've been at this for 75 minutes, James.
Yeah, the plus whatever amount of time we ramped up and organized before we so a good part of an hour. So yeah, the Coutts, there's still 2 in jail, but one of them have I think Anthony Olienick has a new lawyer, and his trial's delayed until February 20th. So I'm not sure if you'll get the same kind of like small firearms related charge, which it is worth saying that in Canada, there are so many rules and regulations around firearms that it is not difficult to charge somebody with a firearms offense.
Yeah,
like,
it's not surprising.
Not as egregious as people think.
Yeah. People hear firearms offense and they think, oh, this guy is, he's a mule for a gang or whatever. Not the case. It's very easy. If in fact, because of our prime minister, if you happen to have a otherwise completely legal model of shotgun for target shooting or for bird hunting that happens to be the all black version, well, then you're a criminal, because the all black version that is in every way functionally identical is a restricted firearm, and the camo version is not restricted. So our gun laws are absolutely bonkers, and it would not be surprising for any gun owner to be found accidentally in contravention of some nonsense provision. Yeah,
it seems like it's there to be weaponized when it needs to be. And it is, no pun intended. It is worth noting that Chris Lysak, his improper storage of a handgun, in that charge, it didn't say for a criminal intent.
So it could be just a civil.
That's the thing. If there was still this motivation to cause harm and wreak havoc or conspiracy to murder a police officer, you think they would tack that on to, like, why is the charge just a random improper storage of a handgun? It's not even tied to any mischief or a misdemeanor activity or anything else like that.
Is it right? I think I may have read this. Is it right that with this plea deal that they took, because of that, they now have no legal recourse against the government? They can't countersue. They can't.
I don't know for sure. I have a feeling that might be true. Or you might have them. You have men who have spent 700 days in not ideal conditions, and they're broken mentally at this point. Like, they are morally.
How could you not be?
You are morally broken. And I think this actually describes why they took a plea deal to just a gun charge. And it doesn't sound like they don't have to serve any time, because the time spent in remand counts towards the charge, and time in solitary it's even worth like 1.75 or 2 times per day. Okay. So they get that towards whatever sentence they would have normally. But if they're just wanting to see their families. And I think for them, they did a cost benefit analysis, and they're like, well, we just want to see our children. We want to get out, and we're done with this. And to fight it, well, it could take another year, and they could run out of money. And there's been all kinds of issues with funding and with lawyers. And there's even some parasitic individuals, like getting close to family members and trying to get access to funding. And there's a whole clusterfuck, and it's worth a greater exploration, because there's a lot of details there, and a lot of the information's still not even clear. But the fact that 2 of them are out is great, and hopefully the other 2 get out as well. Yeah, and we'll link some individuals, I think, or like some accounts to follow. Because even like you had a couple independent reporters following this. You had Mocha Bazurgan, who was there almost for every important day of trial.
Yeah, he's doing good stuff. We should link to him in the comments.
Yeah, you also had Jason Levine. He was following everything there as well, and he was reporting on some of the issues with the funding and the crowdfunding for lawyers and those issues there. And it's also worth us exploring. Right now, Ezra Levant of Rebel News is on a blocking spree, blocking a whole bunch of individuals who called him out because he had a raise money for truckers. Well, he had a page to raise money for the truckers in Coutts, and they're asking, well, where's the money now? It seems like because of the severity of these charges, the conspiracy to murder police officers, a lot of even the alternative media did not want to touch this.
Yeah.
Everybody's distancing themselves. So if that's all that's needed to create a chilling effect, this is going to be weaponized in the future, that
for sure
these kind of charges will reduce dissent, because people will not want to protest because they don't want a bogus charge. They don't want to, even if they're innocent, they don't want to go through 1 or 2 years of legal fees and the process, or be stuck in purgatory without bail. Like they're stuck in prison at this point. So it has a cooling effect. And there's a lot to unpack further with some of this, because we are not in a good place in Canada for this to happen. This should be all over the news. Yeah. This is not a partisan issue.
No, this is the country taking political prisoners, which they've just admitted essentially, because they dropped the
original charge was it was dropped.
It's not that it was like, I think that needs to be hammered home a little bit, because it's not that it's not that it was a charge that was legitimate, that was fought in a court of law and found to be false. By dropping it, they've admitted that it was horseshit.
Yeah, 100%. So
yeah, that's Canada's a country that takes political prisoners now. So and it takes, apparently, if your timeline is what actually happened here, it takes a a famous American media personality to mention it and to become more widely known for some action to happen. The timing does seem rather convenient, doesn't it? I think we should do a full episode deep dive into this, I think.
Yeah, I think there's multiple facets of this whole situation. It's hard to know exactly what started the change, because this is all of a sudden, but the correlation of both Danielle Smith and Tucker Carlson talking about this, I don't know, that's a lot of eyes on this issue that was muted for the longest time. It wasn't getting very much traction at all.
Well,
so yeah, been a crazy couple of weeks.
Yeah, and this was all in the last like 10 days. So that's some big
shifts in the conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, and largely for the better, I think. So we'll monitor these things, and I'm sure they'll come up in conversation again, and we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into Coutts for sure in the future, and we'll see how that story progresses with the remaining two. Just a quick question: do you know? So the third guy has gotten new representation. His trial is in a couple weeks. Do we know much about the fourth guy? What's going on with him?
I don't have that information. I'm not actually quite sure. And also, there's so little information on this, and there is a lot behind a publication ban that I don't know if all the pieces are there yet, even because of how new this is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah, and we'll link to some good resources and people to follow and to stay on top of this.
Yeah, very good. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, James.
Yeah, good dissecting the last couple of weeks, and good to touch base on this.
Always a pleasure.
All right, till next time.
All right, cheers.